So if you didn't see part 1 of this video, then obviously this one you're watching now, part 2, will make more sense, but it's not totally essential viewing. You can just watch from here. But in short, I'm responding to Christian from Kangaroo English, whom I think is awesome. I think he's a great guy, but I think he's pretty wrong about what learning a language through input means, and in particular about what language acquisition actually is. So that's what we're going to get into in this video.
I know something that everyone knows if they take a moment to reflect. You get good at what you practice. And that's why I have an obligation to talk about why this obsession with input is so dangerous. Because it doesn't explain the full story. And I think mainly it's a problem of definitions. First, let's ask two vital questions. 1, what does it mean to acquire a language? And 2, what do you want? Okay, so first, what does it mean to acquire a language? If you define language acquisition, if you define knowing a language as being able to comprehend it and process it and understand it, then I suppose that the input hypothesis is correct. That is hardly what most language learners want.
Okay, so it's here that I think Christian reveals a pretty serious error in his understanding, and he's kind of basing that whole argument on this error. When talking about language acquisition, and I believe it was Krashen himself who coined the term, whether he coined it or adopted it, I'm not sure. He did so in order to make a distinction where no previous distinction in English had existed. Christian uses the word definition about acquisition of a language, but he then goes to show that what he thinks it means to acquire a language is absolutely not what Krashen meant, and is not what most people mean when they talk about language acquisition. And I think here is where the problem lies. It sounds like making a distinction between acquisition and learning is the same as making a distinction between a movie and a film. A film sounds more prestigious. It sounds like more effort has been put into it. But we all just know that they're two words for the same thing that have a very slightly different connotation, but they really mean the same thing. That is not the case for language learning versus language acquisition.
It's not an accident that people call themselves English speakers or Japanese speakers when they talk about their language abilities. The ability to speak, of course, is quite valued and, in my experience, considered a fundamental skill. I wonder how many learners would believe in a teacher that says, "In my classroom, you will learn to acquire language, but not produce it."
Yeah, but no. To be fair to Christian, it does sound like acquisition means that, but it doesn't. It's not acquiring a language versus speaking a language. That's not the distinction being made. It's acquiring versus skill building. Okay, so skill building is saying this is how you say X, this is how you say Y, this is how you say Z, and if you want to say Y and X together, then you have to remember that the verb goes here, or you have to remember that possessive nouns are conjugated like so, and so on and so forth, until hopefully one day you can say everything. Now, it doesn't mean that the student will have to translate in their head the entire time that they speak the language. I know this firsthand because I have done this. I used to learn this way, but it is a common misconception of the input-heavy crowd that a student who does that will always have to translate, and that is not the case. But it does mean that for everything you want to say, you have to hope that you know a way to say it that is correct. If you're trying to say X and P and N and C, then you have to cognitively know a rule for how those go together. If you happen to remember that N can never occur directly after P, maybe you remember that N can then be placed at the beginning instead, or you can say NXPC, or maybe you don't remember that and you just say it wrong. Now, this can definitely work because it's what most people do, but one problem with this is that it often involves knowing the role that each word serves in the sentence. If you know that adverbs always go at the start, for example, then you've got to know which one the adverb is, and a lot of people don't. And the other problem with this is that on top of thinking about what you actually want to say, like the meaning that you're conveying, you've also got to be constantly checking against this sort of grammar that you've got going on that what you're saying is correct, and this is exhausting. Now, of course, you can build up the skills so that certain words and phrases are at a point of automation, but it means that every time you want to say something that you've never said before, you sort of have to run the numbers on it, if you get me. And you can normally tell that this is what a person is doing while they're speaking, or even while they're writing. I actually had an interaction with one of Christian's followers who was arguing that you have to know all the grammar inside out, and unsurprisingly, this person's grammar and English in general was pretty bad, but the errors they made were very, very predictable. That is, every error they made, you could imagine a situation in which that would have been correct, but this was not the situation. And he was very confident that my English was full of errors because his conscious model was that XYZ is right and anything outside of that is wrong, even if it's a native speaker using it. So that is my experience with the skill building approach. It works well up until a certain point, and I talk about that in the first video. Language acquisition, on the other hand, is an unconscious process similar to that of a baby learning to walk. As a baby, or a soon-to-be toddler, lets go of the table and sort of wobbles a whole step before they fall over, and then does a similar thing the next day, and then 2 days later they might do the same thing, except that this time they fall over after 2 steps. They don't consciously process any of the feedback they get. They probably don't really even understand what it is they're trying to do. They certainly don't make conscious adjustments to it. They might try one thing only to discover that this leads them to topple left, and then they might do that 20 times. But it's not as if on the 21st time they think, oh, I see, I was putting my right foot too far inside and that's why I was always toppling left. No, they just make unconscious adjustments to their own model until eventually they develop a perfectly intuitive understanding of their own balance and how walking works, and it gets increasingly complex. Again, with no conscious alteration, their model starts taking into account slopes and different surfaces and speed and turning, and it's a massively complex model to build, and all able-bodied people have this model, and we don't even know it's there. What's curious about this is that alterations to the model were made by babies, but not conscious alterations, unconscious ones. And this is more like what it's like to acquire a language. Expressing an idea or a response, or even having a thought in the language that you have acquired to a high level, becomes an unconscious process. The same way that if someone says, "Can you get me that book off the table, please?" You don't think about the hundreds of movements that you'll have to make in order to get the book. You just do it while you might be wondering what they want the book for. You're concerned with the meaning of the task, not the action itself. You're not thinking, okay, well, the table is 5.4 meters away, so I guess that's like 8 or 9 steps. So if it's 8 steps, then my first step will be right-footed, which means my last one will have to be left-footed, so I have to take that into account. Now, I know that all sounds a bit ridiculous, but consider that speaking a language is actually much more complicated than walking. There's a smaller margin for error. 2 things that sound very similar can mean very different things, and there's just far more data that needs to be processed in order to develop a functioning model. Yet, just like walking, we're expected to be able to do it, and we want to be able to do it completely automatically, unconsciously. And I have now come to believe in the last 18 months or so that the fastest and most effective way to go for this subconscious or unconscious model of the language is to try to acquire it through input. And this is not what I believed 18 months ago. If you didn't see the first video, I spoke about how I spoke a lot in French and Swedish, and it did work up until a point.
Let's do a thought experiment. So I sit down and I watch a video on YouTube from a surgeon that shows me how to perform brain surgery. I totally comprehend the video and everything that the surgeon does. Have I acquired the knowledge of this operation? If not, how many videos would I need to watch before I acquired the knowledge? Is that knowledge useful?
Okay, I think this is why most people are not ready to properly hear the input hypothesis. Even if they hear it and think they've understood it, they may well not have understood it. It's extremely counterintuitive. I spoke about that in the first video. And the thing is, I don't think it's comparable to basically any other field of study or knowledge, and that includes medicine or surgery. Earlier in his video, Christian said that saying that you learn a language through input is not the whole story, and I agree. It's definitely not the whole story, but saying that you get good at what you practice, that's not the whole story either. You do not get good at what you practice if you don't know what it is you're trying to practice or what success in that practice would even look like. Let's say that you want to learn to play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata on the piano. Now, you don't already play the piano, but you get someone to give you a quick rundown of how to read sheet music, and then you just go slowly through it, note by note, learning how to play it. Now, assuming you were obsessed enough to tolerate this for a long time, then it would totally work. I know this because it's exactly what I did when I was 15 years old. It was the first time I'd ever touched a piano. It was the first piece I learned on piano. It's way too hard for a beginner. It's in C# minor, which is not an easy key, even for experienced pianists. And I was learning to read sheet music as I went, and it took 6 months. You do get good at what you practice. But I had heard the piece many times, and I kept listening to it repeatedly as I learned the piece. If I had read the music incorrectly, I would know instantly, because what I played would not line up with what I knew to be correct, and so I'd think, maybe I've read that wrong. And then I'd learn a more refined rule, like, oh, that symbol that I was just ignoring, thinking that it didn't matter, means natural, which means in this one instance, it's not sharp. And by the way, that lasts for the rest of the bar, even if it's not indicated for the rest of the bar, but then it has to reset the next bar, etc., etc. So eventually, my cognitive understanding, which was very imperfect, was brought into line with my intuitive understanding, which was formed from knowing exactly how the music should sound, because listening to music is essentially input in this analogy. This is how a lot of people, I would say the vast majority of people, learn a musical instrument. You can use sheet music or some kind of notation like guitar tabs, and they can be of great assistance, but you don't always need them because you know what the music sounds like. However, this is not how most people approach language learning. Most people try to start speaking before having any idea if what they're saying is actually correct. Now, of course, it's normally in a setting where you're either told what to say or someone gets the opportunity to correct you. So it's not that it doesn't work, it definitely has worked many times. But think about how inefficient that is. Let's imagine 15-year-old me had exactly the same approach to learning that Beethoven piece, but instead of already knowing the piece intricately like I did, I had only heard snippets of random Beethoven pieces here and there, and none of them necessarily the Moonlight Sonata. Maybe I've heard something from the Moonlight Sonata, but maybe not. I would have no idea if what I was playing even sounded like the Moonlight Sonata. If I've got a really good ear, I might be able to tell that it sounds like Beethoven, but it wouldn't be an existing Beethoven piece. It would just be my own version of what Beethoven sounds like to me, and it would always sound wrong to someone who knew Beethoven's work intricately, in this analogy, a native speaker. So continuing with our metaphor for efficiency, in order to play the Moonlight Sonata well, without hearing it many times beforehand, I would need to get someone who had heard the Moonlight Sonata, or at least Beethoven music, for like 6 hours a day for their entire life, to come around to my house and watch me practice and tell me every time I played a note wrong. Now, obviously that would take so long that it would be not doable. This is how most people learn languages, and this is why you get people who've been speaking a language for a very long time and still say stuff that just no native speaker ever says. I've tried for several weeks now, and I can't come up with anything that is the same as language learning, in that it's very common for people to attempt it before they've got any idea of how to assess themselves. A quick example of just one of the many ways that this can go wrong. I had a Chinese student of English who spoke English really well, quite fluently, but would always say wanna to. He wanted to, I wanted to, and it turned out that some idiot Australian had told her that in order to sound more Australian, she should say wanna and not want to. He did not make it clear, however, that that is instead of saying want to and not instead of saying want. So this student had just replaced the word want with wanna in her head, which led her to say wanna too all the time. And it took well over a year of my correcting her every single time she said it, because she was allowing a poor explanation to dictate her model rather than allowing real English that she'd heard in input to dictate it. If she had paid more attention to input, she'd have realized, oh, they do say wanna, but only as short for want to, not every time they want to say want, because otherwise it would be wanna too, which is exactly what she said. So yes, of course I agree with Christian that you do get good at what you practice, but proponents of massive input would argue that by practicing without getting a lot of input, you have no idea if you're practicing correctly and will almost certainly practice something that isn't right.
Think about how the idea of selling the importance of input discriminates against a majority of the world's languages. The fact is that most of the world's languages have never been written down, ever. But we have all become indoctrinated into the idea that recorded language is king. That if it's written in a book, or recorded as a podcast, or put on television, then it is real language that needs to be digested. And once you've done that, you have acquired the language. Well, apart from a tiny percent of languages on the planet, that attitude won't get you very far. Apart from the fact that most languages produce hardly any output, so there is little or no input to digest, how will you ever use that language if you don't know how to speak it or write it?
Okay, so this is playing a bit of a numbers game, and it is true. And Christian, being the compassionate and charitable guy that he is, I can see why it annoys him. But speaking of things not being the whole story, yes, only a tiny percentage of the world's languages are written down. But those languages represent like 99.9% of the languages that anyone is trying to learn. Now, whether this is right or wrong from a world peace and poverty ending perspective, it is just a fact. If a language has a way of making itself known to other people, such as being written or recorded or being spoken by a huge number of people, which also often leads to it being written and recorded, then people are just going to pay more attention to it. And that's not elitist, even if it is unfortunate. This hasn't really got anything to do with the input hypothesis, except that it's obviously going to be harder to get comprehensible input in, say, Darawal than it is in, say, French, but other than that, it's not really a myth of input, it's just a bit of a bummer. Now, if I were trying to learn Darawal or any of the Indigenous Australian languages, I would need to try and speak to Aboriginal people, because obviously you can't do this through input. There is just not enough material out there. But it would still involve listening, and I think the main thing that the input hypothesis has brought to my language learning is to help me adopt the attitude that the person speaking knows more than me. When I was speaking a lot, as I said in the first video, I was quite cocky. I was like, yeah, I know how this works. But I didn't, and I still don't. And if I were to learn a language like an Indigenous language of either Australia or any place, then I would just more inherently understand that the person who is speaking has more valuable things to say than I will be able to say. So I would spend a lot of time repeating what they're saying, and I think it's just a more modest approach in general than always trying to get your point of view out there. I'm not saying that you could learn those languages in the same way. I just think that people always rushing to speak is something the world needs less of. Said the YouTuber.
Maybe that's the part that upsets me most about the input hypothesis. It's not generous. It doesn't seek to contribute. It doesn't add anything. It just wants to suck on language like a parasite.
Okay, that was strong. Here's where I think that Christian's idea that input and language acquisition are the opposite of actually speaking the language makes this part just go really wrong. Like I said, it's not acquisition versus speaking, it's acquisition versus skill building, and it definitely can contribute. I firmly believe that it is more efficient and in the end more effective, and learning a language to a high level is in itself a contribution. Someone like Dogen contributes to the Japanese community by helping foreigners to speak better Japanese. I hope to do the same someday by helping foreigners to speak better Swedish. There are a lot of people in Sweden who don't speak Swedish even as well as I do, and I don't speak it that well, and I believe that is because they're going about it the wrong way. I hope to contribute in that way. We're not sucking on the language like parasites do. That was a bit silly.
That brings us to the most important. What do you want? That is the first question that any good teacher asks. And so it's also the first question that should be considered by any good teaching theory. If you want only to acquire language, then please spend all of your time and energy on comprehensible input.
Okay, so this is totally fair. If you want to speak the language as soon as possible, don't try to acquire it first, because in the early stages, speaking a lot is definitely faster, and I think that people can even obtain a pretty high level by speaking early. I know people who have, and I also know a lot of people who haven't. Like, they've spoken English for years, and I can still barely understand them, and they can still barely understand me. But again, Christian makes this statement under the false impression that acquisition is as opposed to speaking, and it's not. It's acquisition with the aim of speaking fluently and well.
If you want to get good at reading, read more. If you want to get good at speaking, speak more. If you want to get good at writing, write more. And getting good at all of those things will require years of hard work and a healthy dose of deliberate practice.
Okay, so here Christian introduces the term deliberate practice, which is another commonly misunderstood term, in my view. Yes, I very much believe in the benefits of deliberate practice, and I believe that the reason most adult native speakers can speak their language so well is that in high school, and especially university if they went, they are forced to output their language in a very specific way. They're given feedback on that. They're forced to consider the limitations of their own linguistic ability. Is there another way you could have said that? Is there a way you could express that idea more succinctly or just better? But deliberate practice will always involve knowing what success looks like. And if you speak early without a lot of input, you tend to think that success is just words coming out of your mouth. You see this all the time with language learners who are very confident in their abilities because they have the ability to speak fluently, that is without stopping, but they make a lot of mistakes, they don't express ideas very succinctly, or they're just using wrong words all over the place. They think they're successful because they've practiced at this, but they haven't practiced anything that's actually correct, and they've got no way of knowing that. Practice doesn't get you anywhere if you don't properly understand what it is you're practicing. Going back to the Beethoven example, I'm not at all an accomplished pianist, like not by any stretch of the imagination, but I would often listen to high-level pianists practice, and the best ones would always practice tiny sections until they had nailed it like 10 times in a row, and then they would play the context for that, like 2 bars on either side, and then they would play the context for that, like 4 bars on either side of that, and they would never ever move on until they'd gotten like a whole section right. And sometimes I would hear those same people play a piece right through when we were just waiting for a rehearsal or something, and once I even said to one of them, "Oh, you sneaking in some practice?" And he kind of went, "Oh, this isn't really practice, I'm just kind of messing around." And I was like, you're playing the piece, how is that not practice? He didn't consider playing the whole piece through, not worrying about whether he made mistakes or anything, as practice. He only considered practice when he had a very deliberate outcome that he was trying to achieve. And you can find a bunch of books that back up this idea of what deliberate practice actually is. Most people consider speaking their language to be practice, and certainly some practice may occur in passing, but deliberate practice is more like nailing certain sentences, certain sounds, listening out for particular things, those kinds of things. Now, I know this has been a very long video, but don't worry, part 3 of the video will be the shortest by far, and I'm going to talk about the implication that Christian kind of makes here at the end, that proponents of input-based learning are out there to make money. See my thoughts on that, so hang around and all that, and I'll see you then. Bye.